The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The King of Saudi Arabia has passed away at 90 years of age. We're speaking of King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. Passed away at age 90. Prince Salman bin Abdulaziz was appointed as the new king, according to state television. And the new king, Lewis, no spring chicken, 79 years old and already in very poor health. In August of 2010, he underwent spine surgery in the U.S., remained out of the kingdom for recovery, had a stroke in spite of physiotherapy, and his left arm does not work well. After his appointment as crown prince, numerous analysts, including Simon Henderson, argued that he is suffering from dementia and is also believed to be suffering from Alzheimer's disease. So, I think that the natural reaction of many was to wonder what possibilities open up now with the passing of King Abdullah in terms of the U.S. either, number one, ending the alliance with Saudi Arabia, that is one of the most oppressive regimes, considered by some to be the one of the top five most oppressive regimes in the world. Either ending that alliance or possibly being able to influence change in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'm not particularly optimistic about either of those happening.
Me neither. I don't think much is going to happen here. I think our relationship is going to pretty much stay the same with them until the oil dries up or unless there's some war, large-scale war in the Middle East.
Back in 2003, Parade Magazine's David Wolokinski rated King Fahd and Crown Prince Abdullah as the second worst dictators in the world. Remember that Saudi citizens live under strict Wahhabist interpretation of Sharia law. So you have kind of Islam, then you have Islam under Sharia law, and then you have a Wahhabist interpretation of Sharia law under Islam. And that most extreme scenario is the one that is in place in Saudi Arabia. As we've talked about, Saudi Arabian women's rights, just an absolute disaster. There is a de facto theocratic state, and yet we still have people who have a problem with the lifting of the Cuban embargo, seemingly unfazed by this strong alliance with Saudi Arabia, and something needs to be done.
I think a lot of American citizens don't even think about it. They don't even consider it. It just is what it is. And you know what? A lot of them like oil too. So that's a big problem.
Huge news continuing from my home country of Argentina around what was supposedly initially reported as the suicide of prosecutor Alberto Nisman. Alberto Nisman had long accused Iran of planning and financing the 1994 attack on a Jewish center in Argentina. It left 85 people dead. And then earlier this month, Nisman intensified his claims, saying that Argentinian President Cristina Kirchner and top aides were trying to subvert his 10-year investigation into the bombing, allegations which the government did reject. And Mr. Nisman was scheduled to testify last Monday morning, to lawmakers about the accusations, reportedly with recorded evidence of these conversations between government officials and Iranian officials. And hours before he was scheduled to testify, Mr. Nisman found dead. Almost immediately, this was ruled a suicide. And we speculated, Lewis, about the different possibilities in terms of, if it was a suicide, was it a coerced suicide because Nisman's family maybe had been threatened? Was it Nisman maybe because he had made up all of the charges, unlikely as that seems, saying, wow, now I have to testify and I'm going to have to either admit that I lied or what do I do? And then maybe he took his own life. Or was it the Argentinian government who took him out? Or was it maybe the Iranian terror cells that he has long said exist in South America, who wanted to prevent this intrusion into the possible deals that they were making with the Argentinian president? Cristina Kirchner, the president of Argentina, has now said, I no longer believe that this was a suicide, but it is not what you think. It is not the Argentinian president admitting that there was some kind of foul play here, that of the type that was suggested, but concocting a new theory, Lewis, which I find to be extremely conspiratorial. And Cristina Kirchner's new theory is that indeed Alberto Nisman was murdered. But he was murdered by someone who opposes the Kirchner administration, knowing that if he ends up dead, she and her administration would be the ones accused. So this, Lewis, is quite a conspiracy that she has concocted here in the absence of any evidence.
I guess this is the type of conspiracy she has to come up with, the type of explanation she has to come up with, because it was very clear that this was not a suicide. And I think she knew that eventually that was going to be accepted.
And for people who say these were just allegations from Mr. Nisman, he did say that he had transcripts and recordings of intercepted phone calls alleging that the Argentinian government was pursuing a secret deal with Iran to exchange Iranian oil for Argentinian grains and seeking to shield Iranian officials from charges that they had orchestrated the 1994 bombing in Argentina at the Jewish Center, which is for the most part a foregone conclusion. And I actually did receive a few emails, Lewis, from people in Argentina, not family members, not friends, just Argentinians who watch our show, saying that I'm completely in the tank for the anti-Christina activists and et cetera, et cetera. I am only tangentially, superficially involved in Argentinian politics. And to the extent that I am, when Christina Kirchner deserves criticism, I will not hesitate to criticize her. And that's what we've done on the program. But it is by no means a partisan thing. I just evaluate each thing that happens.
Yeah. And we've covered the president. She has said and done some very strange things.
Yes.
And I think those things have been worthy of our scrutiny.
The understatement of the year so far from Lewis, that Argentinian President Christina Kirchner has done some strange things. I think that that's a very, very nice way to put it. Let's talk about the continued follow-up to the Paris massacre involving the Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine offices, as well as a kosher supermarket or kosher market outside of Paris. We have heard all sorts of hypotheses and conspiracy theories regarding what took place there in Paris, but the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are continuing to escalate and actually reaching even a scale that I would not have predicted. And last time we talked about this and we said anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have exploded in France after the Charlie Hebdo and kosher market massacre. I received emails, just straight up anti-Semitic emails saying that, of course, a Jew like me would be out there rejecting these hypotheses, but that they all make perfect sense. Here's another one. This was Dana Kennedy from the Daily Beast, interviewed on MSNBC, and she spoke to French Algerian Muslims in the outskirts of Paris who believe that it was not only a Jewish conspiracy, the Charlie Hebdo attacks, but that it was specifically shape-shifting magical Jews. I'll let her explain it to you.
Well, I went out to what they call the suburbs of France, which are not what Americans think of as suburbs. They're really the housing projects. They're outside Paris, and there are a couple areas inside Paris where a lot of poor Muslims live. And I talked to a cross-section of mainly French Algerian young men who said it was pretty much, they felt, the attacks were actually a conspiracy by the Jews to make Muslims look bad. And they told me that one person told me that, in fact, they weren't just regular Jews that were doing this. In fact, they were a race of magical Jews, shape-shifting Jews that were master manipulators and could be everywhere at the same time. Jose...
When in doubt, blame the Jews is a pretty common refrain, Lewis, but when in doubt, blame the magical shape-shifting Jews pushes it a little further.
This is the type of thing that you read about sometimes and you think, well, this is some really old paranoia, some really old anti-Semitic stuff. No, this stuff is still happening all over the world.
And it is, you're right in one sense, which is that this is not a new thing. The belief in Jewish supernatural abilities to carry out their wicked plans is not that uncommon in the Middle East. Back in 2003, during a speech to religious students, you might remember that Mehdi Taeb, who actually headed up a think tank and was considered close to Supreme Leader Khamenei, said that Jews are powerful sorcerers who have used their abilities to attack Iran. And he also noted that the Jews have not yet even unleashed their full powers. So at some point, Lewis, presumably, the Jews will truly unleash their full powers. I wish that I knew anyone who could talk to me about where these powers come from and why I, as a Jewish individual, have no access or even knowledge of such powers.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't let everyone in on that ultimate plan where all the Jews will assemble like some type of transformer or robot and take over the world.
I'd be curious, Lewis's dad is Iranian and is married to a Jewish woman. You would think that your parents would be the couple with insight into all of this stuff.
Well, I'm not sure how much of this stuff my dad was exposed to when he was young and in Iran. I think probably not much. I think it was probably off the radar.
The U.S. Senate has voted overwhelmingly, 98-1, to approve an amendment that affirms that climate change is real and not a hoax. And this was an amendment to legislation that aims to force the approval of the Keystone XL pipeline, which would, as I'm sure you've heard either from me or from others, would carry oil from the Canadian oil sands into the United States. Senators opposed to the pipeline, who say it would simply accelerate climate change, not create jobs, be bad for the environment, are using votes on the bill as an opportunity to sort of force Republican senators into admitting that climate change is not a hoax. I actually am not as thrilled with this as some of our audience is. I received so many emails, Lewis, from people in our audience saying, David, we have Republicans on record saying that climate change is not a hoax. But when you read into the Republican comments around this amendment, you will see that this may actually backfire in this particular sense. We talked to you about how 72% of Senate Republicans are climate deniers. Now that we have this on record, when we go to these Republican senators and ask them to explain their positions, they'll say, hey, I voted for that amendment. I admit, I agree that climate change is not a hoax. I simply refuse to acknowledge that humans have anything at all to do with the climate changing. And that's exactly what we heard from Senator James Inhofe, who was one of the last senators to vote in favor. He said, yes, indeed, the climate is changing and it has always changed, period. No reference whatsoever to why it is changing. And this might actually become a kind of tool that Republicans can grasp onto in defending their anti-science positions.
I'm increasingly thinking that that's what this is. I mean, we're talking about a Republican-controlled Senate here, and I mean, there was one vote against this. So they're basically all in agreement, and I just can't help but think that there's something shady going on.
Of course, this will be used as a pretense for Republicans to say, we are all on the side of science. We all agree that the climate is changing. However, we have no evidence, they will say, that humans have anything to do with those changes, and thus adding regulations, quote, hurting business is not warranted and it's a bad idea. I think this creates actually a pretext that could really backfire on those who are really working very hard to reduce carbon emissions, curb pollution, and work on the climate change issue. But we will see. I would actually love to be wrong about this, but I don't know which way this will ultimately go. Make sure to give us a like on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show. Next, what happens when we have a good guy with a gun and someone who sees that good guy with a gun and doesn't know whether it's a good guy with a gun or not? That's after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
This program is mostly funded by our audience through the David Pakman Show membership program. Today's new member of the day is Matt Arnold. And as a member, Matt Arnold gets access to the world-famous bonus show hosted by producer Lewis, where I am the sidekick, as well as the commercial-free audio and video feeds of the show. And Matt and all other members were invited to last week's David Pakman Show members-only town hall, sort of a quaint video conference with Lewis and with me where the audience asked us questions and we hung out. All members, as always, invited to the town halls. Join Matt Arnold as a David Pakman Show member at davidpakman.com/membership And remember that you can also support the show by doing any Amazon shopping you do after clicking the Amazon banner at davidpakman.com. Doing that makes it so that Amazon sends us a little kickback for everything you buy. We have a lot of questions, Lewis, when we talk about guns in public, whether they're concealed carried guns or open carried guns. And we now actually have video of what happened when Clarence Daniels walked into a Florida Walmart to buy his wife creamer when he was tackled by 43-year-old Michael Foster. Foster apparently witnessed Daniels take his handgun from his vehicle and conceal it under his jacket. Foster then followed Daniels into the store, tackled him, and placed him in a chokehold, reportedly yelling, "He's got a gun!" Daniels reportedly yelled back, "I have a permit." And in the video that we're showing to our audience, the guy doing the tackling looks like he has a full head of white hair, and I'm not sure if the ages are correct. Supposedly it was a 43-year-old tackling a 62-year-old, but a little bit confusing from the video, Lewis. But nevertheless, this tells us a lot about what would happen in these scenarios where people say, well, the Batman shooter, if we had more people with guns in the theater, everything would have been better. But that's not necessarily the case. Here's one case where a man was legally carrying a weapon and he was tackled. What if the tackler had his own gun and said, I've identified this man as a bad guy with a gun. I'm now the good guy with the gun. I'm going to take it out and create a guns drawn situation. How is that a good thing for anybody?
There's one way to look at it. Here's another way to look at it. The man who walked into the Walmart with a gun presumably was a good guy with a gun, right?
Yes, I guess so.
He wasn't going in there to shoot up the place.
No.
He had a permit to carry. Great American, exercising his rights, an American hero, a good guy with a gun. He just got completely dominated by someone who was unarmed. So I guess having a gun on you doesn't always mean that you're going to win the battle or the fight.
So many elements of this story tell us about the insanity of that refrain from the gun fetishists on the right, that more guns in more places are a good thing, and that having more guns and having more people know that others have guns is always a good thing. Clearly not the case. And, you know, we also have the race element here, where it just so happens that it was a black man legally carrying a gun. And does that have an impact? If you see a black man with a gun versus a white man with a gun in a Walmart in Florida. I mean, again, I don't go to Walmart, period. I would never even think about going to a Walmart in Florida. In spite of the fact that I never go to a Walmart, period, in particular in Florida, I would not go to a Walmart. Maybe race is also a factor here. We don't know.
That certainly might have had something to do with it. You don't know. We don't know the mind of the tackler here, though, but it certainly could have played a role.
As we have been discussing for a long time, because of the shifting demographics of the American population towards a higher population, a higher portion of the population being Hispanic and Latino, we know that Republicans need to court the Latino vote to have a viable shot at winning future presidential elections. I believe that based on the prior proportions of racial demographics and voting, in the 2016 election, Republicans would need something like, the Republican presidential candidate would need something like 62% of the white vote to win if they cannot court more of the Hispanic and Latino vote. Unfortunately, that outreach is not going particularly well. Of course, opposition to President Obama's immigration executive action has been hurting Republicans in the polls with Hispanics. But now the Republican National Committee has announced that there will be absolutely no Republican primary debates on Univision, the most watched Spanish language network. Sadly, Lewis, they did not make the cut. That outreach to Hispanic voters is really failing.
It really is. This is great news for Democrats, but yeah, they really need to completely change their game plan here, because they're just stabbing themselves.
And MSNBC also did not get awarded a Republican primary debate. Bloomberg TV not awarded a Republican primary debate. But the difference is that Republicans aren't really counting on, nor do they need, the MSNBC viewership support. They probably already have much of the Bloomberg TV support. They really need the Univision viewership to vote for them if they are to stand a chance. And I don't know what they're thinking.
Now, honestly, in the eyes of some voters, not seeing these primary debates could help the Republicans.
Right, yeah. If all of a sudden you tune in and you're Hispanic and you see what the Republicans are saying, that might make you not vote for them. So maybe you're actually getting at something here.
Yeah, well, if you don't hear them talking about how they deport all of the illegal immigrants, and how they want to shut down the borders, then you might just check off their name on the ballot.
One more note on this. Univision spokesman Jose Zamora spoke to the Huffington Post, and he didn't specifically address the Republican Party's decision not to have a primary debate on Univision, but he did speak broadly about the need to engage Hispanic voters, and he said, quote, "There is a very simple political reality. Hispanics will decide the 2016 presidential election." This is not a crazy comment at all, given what we know about the changing demographics and particularly the importance of the Hispanic vote in historic swing states.
It's an interesting statement. I mean, you could say that Hispanics will decide the vote. You could say that whites would decide the vote.
Sure, I mean, you can argue that without any support from all sorts of groups, the election would be decided, right? If all black people supported one candidate or the other, if all women supported one candidate or the other. But I think the point here is this is a group that is changing so quickly that their support has an increased importance in deciding elections.
Well, as we know, this is a group that in, 50 years, maybe less, will be the very clear majority in the country.
Yeah, I think more like 25 or 30 years, if I recall correctly. Very, very interesting. We'll continue to follow that. Also interesting is Mike Huckabee's latest comment about if he were to run for president, I would presume as a Republican, of course, as he has in the past, he would be doing it in part, he says, not to impose Christian theocracy, but rather because he feels the need to fight what he sees as an existing secular theocracy. I know that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but let's listen to what the former governor had to say.
Is because we've just divorced ourselves from common sense. We've divorced ourselves from an understanding that we cannot survive as a republic if we do not become, once again, a God-centered nation that understands that our laws do not come from man, they come from God. It's the natural law of God. Our founders really understood that and believed it.
They did.
Now, I'm not saying that a person should run and say, let's have a theocracy, because I don't think we should.
It's ridiculous.
No, that's not what even our founders want.
We have a theocracy right now. It's a secular theocracy.
That's it. It's a humanistic, secular,
Absolutely.
atheistic,
Forced
even antagonistic toward Christian faith.
Yep.
And that's what we need to understand. Our basic fundamental rights are being robbed from us, taken from us, piece by piece.
Let's explore this, Lewis. What are the definitions of the words that he's using? A secular theocracy. A theocracy is a system of government in which priests rule in the name of God or a God. And priest doesn't have to be a Catholic priest. It can be, a clergy from whatever religion we're talking about, where clergy rules in the name of God. A secular society is one that has attitudes, activities, or other things that have no religious or spiritual basis. You cannot have, by the fundamental dictionary definition of secular and theocracy, a secular theocracy, unless you are one of these people, which maybe Mike Huckabee is, who sees non-religiosity as a sort of religion, which, as we've talked about, Lewis, is ridiculous. It's like saying not collecting stamps is a hobby. It makes no sense.
If you are an atheist, if you have no religion, you do not worship any deity. There is no. You're right. It makes no sense. This kind of reminds me of when Newt Gingrich said that radical Islamists were going to take over the country and impose atheism on people.
Exactly. That's exactly the first thing that radical Islamists would want to do, make everybody non-religious, which is ridiculous, actually, as we know. This is getting funny, though, because we have Mitt Romney thinking about maybe running again, and he would now be focusing on poverty, as laughable and as stunning as that is, an admission. We have Mike Huckabee, who, if he runs, would be running to prevent or destroy what he sees as a secular theocracy. These Republican primary debates could be some of the best TV watching we've seen in decades.
I'm really looking forward to it. I think they're setting themselves up here for some pretty big falls.
Next, we have word of a sentence for former anonymous member Barrett Brown. We will talk about that. And Google is doing record spending lobbying, but it's not exactly what you might think. We'll tell you about that and more, and your voicemails coming up later today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
A sentence has been handed down of 63 months to former anonymous member Barrett Brown, who has been held for more than 30 months. I'll give you the background on the story, and I think a lot of people are actually misunderstanding what the sentence is for. Back in September of 2012, Barrett Brown was arrested by the FBI for allegedly threatening a federal agent in a video posted to YouTube. And in October of 2012, after being held for 2 weeks without charges, he was indicted of on charges of making an online threat, retaliating against a police officer, and conspiring to release personal information about a government employee. And after years of a legal battle here, the saga seems to have come to a close. He was sentenced to 63 months in prison after pleading guilty to charges of transmitting threats, accessory to hacking charges, and interfering with the execution of a search warrant. Brown's legal team talked about this in the run-up to the sentencing as, quote, "This breaks down to uploading YouTube videos that contained unfortunate statements, efforts to redact sensitive emails that had been procured by hackers, and hiding laptops in a kitchen cabinet." I have mixed feelings about this because, on the one hand, the initial reason that Barrett Brown came to the attention of authorities is one that is of a significant concern to other journalists, which is that if you inadvertently transmit or repost something that others have published, right? You did not leak information or obtain it, but you simply, even as simple as reporting on it and posting a link, you could potentially be charged. And that is a huge, huge concern. But that is not actually what Barrett Brown was sentenced for. Initially, there were charges relating to the dissemination of information, but ultimately he was not actually convicted or charged for that. So while I agree that there are serious concerns in terms of independent journalists, and we've talked about this with WikiLeaks and with Chelsea Manning, et cetera, here, the charges and the sentence, rather, are for acts that resulted around the investigation of Barrett Brown. So should he even have been held indefinitely without charges for a while and then subsequently not given a speedy trial according to the opinion of many? Of course not. And the initial reasons that the authorities started investigating him are questionable. But subsequently, he did commit the acts he was ultimately charged with, prosecuted with, and convicted of. So this is a complex scenario.
It is. I think certainly in some ways he was wronged here, but I don't think this is the case that we point to when we're looking to highlight some of the bigger issues that we're talking about.
There's no question that the entire Barrett Brown scenario is a complete farce of supposed anti-spying law enforcement. I mean, it's a disaster. The amount of time he spent being held before the trial and during, it's all an absolute disaster. But for people who are emailing me saying Barrett Brown got 63 months for forwarding information that he didn't even obtain, factually speaking, that is not why he was sentenced. And I think, Lewis, it's important to remember that.
Yeah, you have to make that distinction. We're not saying that there was no wrongdoing here.
Of course.
But there is, of course, some legitimacy to this conviction.
Google has spent a record amount on Washington lobbyists as it pushes to maintain internet freedom and net neutrality. That's right. We reported on our last program that Sprint has actually come out in favor of internet freedom and in favor of regulating internet service providers under Title II. And we now see that Google is spending a lot of money on lobbying regarding net neutrality, but not to achieve the same outcome as AT&T and Verizon and some of the others. Google has spent $16.8 million to try to prevent legislation from passing that would allow these internet fast lanes or restrict the use of high bandwidth sites and services such as Netflix. And the $16.8 million that Google has spent is a 20% year-over-year increase, and it is the most that Google has ever spent on influencing politicians. We talk a lot about lobbying and the influence of money on politics. Lobbying, by its very nature, is not a positive or negative thing. We could all argue that we should completely remove the influence of money in politics. However, given that we have it, and given the huge corporations that are on the wrong side of the lobbying effort with net neutrality, it's a good thing that Google is willing to put this money into trying to preserve internet freedom. But, Lewis, let's not all pretend that this is just because Google is morally interested in internet freedom alone. They stand to benefit from net neutrality.
They do, but I will say that I do believe that that their boards, that their executives do want net neutrality for the people of this country morally, and that they do think it's morally correct. Of course, it could be financially advantageous as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're sort of speculating, though, right, Lewis? Because Google relies on having a mass of users and websites. If you look at how Google makes money through advertising, it depends on having this sort of level playing field in terms of the ad publishers and the ad consumers. And they have, I mean, a huge portion of their business depends on this model.
That is true. That is true. I guess I am speculating, but it's just my belief. I'm not saying it's fact. And this is interesting here. It's interesting to see if the good guys with lots of money, or I put good guys in quotes, can beat the bad guys with lots of money.
We have Sprint and Google for different reasons and in different ways supporting elements of internet freedom. And then, of course, we have AT&T, Comcast, Time Warner Cable, Verizon, and so many others that are very, very much on the other side. And remember, we have Tom Wheeler, FCC chairman, appointed by President Obama, a former cable lobbyist. So, you know, they do have that going for them. Next, we will talk about FIFA's payment to Brazil from the World Cup revenues, as well as a Christian school that is not allowing the children of gay parents to attend, and your voicemails. What a program we have for you today. Glad you're with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
A non-denominational Christian school in Nashville, Tennessee, has turned down prospective students because their parents are gay. This has obviously drawn criticism from both alumni and gay advocates. It has caused a huge uproar on social media. We're talking about Brian Copeland, who is from Nashville, who made an appointment with Davidson Academy to visit the Madison area school for his two children, a son who's entering pre-kindergarten and a daughter who is 8 months old. But in a January 14th letter, school officials informed him that the school has canceled the visit. Why is that? Because they found out that these children are, Lewis, this is just shocking, being raised in a two-father family. The couple never even got to the point of applying for admissions because the school told Copeland that, quote, another education provider would be a better fit for your children. Therefore, we cannot grant admission to your children. Okay, we get into the same type of thing when we talk about the difference between a public business and a private business, public business and a private church, for example, discriminating. What I'm concerned with here is if this school is essentially considered a church from the point of view of the law, they don't want the children of gay people there. Okay, no gay parent should want, no parent at all, but no gay parent should even want to have their kids in this school if this is their position. So using legal power to force the school to allow the children would be in a way a victory, but at the same time something that I wouldn't like to see. What I would want to be absolutely sure of is that this is not a school, and any school that discriminates in this way, that they are not receiving any federal funding, be it subsidies, vouchers, or anything whatsoever, because then you have government endorsement of this type of discrimination.
And I think that that would depend on the state There are still plenty of states that do give public funding to private schools and private religious schools. I'm not sure. I don't remember if Tennessee is one of them, but I'd agree with you. That would be an abomination, if you will.
And if you listen to what one of the dads said, they really seem to want their kids to have a Christian education. They said, quote, "We chose this school because of its rigorous faith-based K-12 academics and extracurricular activities. And a friend with a son there asked them if a family like ours would be allowed and was told yes. After a phone conversation fully disclosing that we are a two-dad family, an appointment was set for us. I received this letter canceling our appointment without even getting a chance. We want our children to have a Christian education, and we're finding that very, very hard." This might be a sign that Christian educations are not compatible with non-discrimination against gay couples, and maybe it's time to reconsider how important that so-called Christian education would be. Wouldn't you think, as a parent, Lewis, if it's so hard to get your kids into a Christian school because you're gay, maybe the education they would get there wouldn't be the best thing for them?
Yeah, these are some very confused parents right here. And on a side note, the ridicule you'd be subjecting, and possible bullying you'd be subjecting your kid to by putting them in a school like this.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with these guys.
Lewis, if as you said, I'm getting a mush mouth here because I'm so excited about the question. As you have told us, Lewis, if you accidentally had a kid, you would probably love that kid. Are there any circumstances under which you would send your child to a religious school? And this could include, Lewis, the after-school Hebrew school that you participated in one year.
I would not. No, there's no way my child would be involved in any religious nonsense whatsoever.
All right, Lewis, very, very clear about that. Absolutely no hesitation whatsoever. We could say Lewis is fervent about his point of view. Let's talk about FIFA, Brazil, and money. We've talked many times about how Olympics and World Cups often don't actually support the economies of the countries in which they are conducted in any significant way, and oftentimes are actually really bad for a lot of the people in the areas where the games and sporting events are played. And we now have some data about the recent World Cup in Brazil. FIFA, the governing body of international soccer, said that it set up a $100 million World Cup legacy fund for Brazil, aimed at funding sports facilities, youth and women's soccer, medical and health projects, etc. A couple years ago, FIFA president Sepp Blatter pledged to give some of the revenue from the 2014 World Cup back to grassroots programs in the country. Now, let's look at some of the numbers. $100 million, it sounds like a lot, right, Lewis? $100 million to get from FIFA, that's fantastic.
Well, when I consider what it costs Brazil to host the games, I think, no, that's totally, minuscule.
It cost Brazil $15 billion in spending to equip the country in terms of facilities and people and resources for this World Cup. And $100 million has now been offset. By the way, this raked in about $4 billion for FIFA. So this is not a significant amount of the money FIFA took in, and it offsets a very, very tiny amount of the money that Brazil spent. And this, I think, is in black and white, on paper, part of why these events can really not be particularly beneficial for countries. And then you could say, well, maybe the other 14 point whatever billion are offset by the intangibles of added employment in Brazil or added tourism to Brazil. But time and time again, we see that those are not significant anytime beyond when the event is actually taking place.
Yeah, and it's actually the opposite, because those areas can end up in much worse condition than they were before the games. And so I think the games can be very harmful in some ways. And
let me remind you that 90% of the money that Brazil spent on new and refurbished stadiums, the stadium specifically, so that was $3 billion, 90% of that $3 billion was public money. And initially there was this promise from the Brazilian president Lula that the stadiums would be privately financed. That didn't happen, and the money isn't even coming back. There's a really strong case to make. And Lewis, I hate to make this case because I love the World Cup. I'm from Argentina. I've grown up around soccer my entire life. This was a South American World Cup. I mean, this is just great in so many ways. And it really pains me that this just seems to be so damaging to the actual people of Brazil.
Yeah, and I don't see FIFA making any changes. People just love soccer so much that they're willing to overlook all of this every time.
And as we talked about with Dave Zirin back around the World Cup, you don't have to boycott the World Cup because you have a problem with much of how it's financed and structured. You can still watch it, but be active around that. And I agree with Dave Zirin, but at the same time, for the majority of people, the joy and excitement of the event really supersedes any desire to be aware of or activating around the problems. And it's just a tough situation. I mean, we see sex trafficking around Super Bowls here in the U.S., and I mean, for me, I either couldn't care less about the Super Bowl or I'm really into it because my team is in it. And in either case, it can really be hard to get traction around the problems surrounding these events.
It's sad. It's sad. And FIFA is the biggest violator of all with the World Cup. I hope that there are some big changes there soon.
FIFA and the Olympics, I'd say, are the biggest organizations that are problematic around this. If you have any comments at all about our program, call our voicemail number, 219-2DAVID-P. Let's take a listen to this voicemail.
You know, Tom Hartman has a solution for the gun problem. Just make everybody that has a gun have to carry insurance. The insurance company will take care of making sure you keep that gun safe. Otherwise, they won't insure it. Makes sense to me. To drive a car, you have to have insurance. Why not a gun? He's a pretty smart guy. And yes, he still does call Fox so-called news.
Yeah. So listen, we've also talked about gun insurance. In fact, a couple years ago, back in January of 2013, and then more recently, we talked about what about mandatory gun insurance, using the exact same argument that Tom Hartman, I've heard him use. The gun represents a liability. It's a social and societal liability, the same way that driving a car is, the same way that if you have a home, there's liability there. And sometimes you have to have insurance. Absolutely something we have discussed. It's a very, very interesting idea. And I would be interested in having more discussions around it. I don't know whether, I don't even know what the political structure that would be necessary to mandate gun insurance would be, Lewis. Would that be something that's done at the state level, at the federal level? Maybe it could be either.
Yeah, I mean, like with driving and car insurance, every state has a different way of structuring it. But I don't think it would ever fly because there's nothing in the Second Amendment that says you can insure. You might have to pay insurance on your guns, right? No,
but there's also nothing in the Second Amendment that talks about a lot of the weapons that now are favored by the gun fetishists as definitely part of their constitutional rights. So I think there's certainly some interpretation of that Second Amendment happening no matter what. On today's bonus show, the U.S. government funds research into a gay hookup app. Prince Andrew is accused of paying for sex with a minor, and Singapore will not tolerate you throwing your cigarette butts. We will talk about all of those stories and more on today's bonus show. The bonus show is more show. If you like this show, you would like the bonus show, and you can access it by becoming a David Pakman Show member at davidpakman.com/membership. That is the quickest route to supporting this program and getting access to all the great membership benefits, including one of the favorite benefits of membership is the commercial-free television program. Instead of these 3 to 5 minute clips on YouTube, you get one nice long video for members only. davidpakman.com/membership. Talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.